Dámy a pánové, dobré ráno. Dobré ráno vám všem, kteří jste zavítali i na druhý den mezinárodní vědecké konference nazvané European Agri-Food Sustainability and Innovation. Právo na potraviny je jedním z klíčových lidských práv. Je pevně a také závazně zakotveno v právu mezinárodním. Je uznáno například ve Všeobecné deklaraci lidských práv z roku 1948 a také v Mezinárodním paktu o hospodářských, sociálních a kulturních právech z roku 1996. Na stranu druhou jenom za jeden jediný rok se odhaduje přibližně 600 milionů nemocí přenášených potravinami, které jsou způsobeny nebezpečnými a také nekvalitními surovinami, což je zase z globálního hlediska enormní hrozbou pro lidské zdraví a pro jednotlivé národní ekonomiky. Dámy a pánové, tato mezinárodní vědecká konference je oficiální akcí českého předsednictví v Radě Evropské unie a koná se za podpory Evropského úřadu pro bezpečnost potravin. Vítám všechny vzácné zahraniční i tuzemské hosty, vítám všechny odborníky, jejichž příspěvky nás potom v následujících minutách čekají. Pokud jste tu včera s námi nemohli být, tak já jenom ve stručnosti shrnu, co všechno jsme tady prožili. My jsme na konferenci hned v úvodu přivítali paní komisařku DG Sante Stelu Kyriakides, zástupce DG Agri Mačeje Goluběvského, byl mezi námi také pan doktor Bernard Url a ministr zemědělství České republiky Zdeněk Nekula. Oni se ve svých úvodních projevech shodli na udržení vysokého standardu bezpečnosti produktů v rámci celého potravinového řetězce v Evropě a zavázali se také k aktivnímu naplňování cílů, které vedou k udržitelné produkci. Pan europoslanec Martin Hlaváček upozornil také na přílišnou politickou angažovanost Evropské komise a zároveň vyzval k potřebě jednat v oblasti udržení soběstačnosti a konkurenceschopnosti Evropské unie. Můžeme asi shrnout, že politické zastoupení na konferenci, včetně paní europoslankyně Michaely Šojdrové, se shodly, že důležité je napříč celým potravinářsko-zemědělským sektorem věnovat se vzájemné spolupráci a pochopitelně komunikaci. Zástupcům vědy, panu profesoru Doležalovi a také panu profesoru Pečinkovi a Ursule Vincent děkujeme potom za jasnou zprávu, že nové genomické techniky jsou připraveny pro bezpečnou rostlinnou produkci, ale abychom je mohli využít, tak se musí opravdu zvážit rozumný přístup. Současné poznatky vědy zatím nedovolují detekovat produkty nových genomických technik v jejich plné šíři. Vědecké pokroky se musí dál podporovat, výzkum, vývoj, investice, to by měly být asi základní pilíře k udržitelnosti nebo na cestě k udržitelnosti. A právě na tom se ve své včerejší odborné části konference shodli Dirk Jacobs z Food Drink Europe a Olivier de Matos z asociace CropLife. Zajímavým zakončením této části včerejší konference byl potom příspěvek Sabine Neumann z amerického ministerstva zemědělství, ve kterém nás seznámila s regulatorním a také podpůrným systémem pro přípravky na ochranu rostlin i přímou komunikaci se zemědělci a spíše nenásilnou formou přestupu na udržitelnou produkci v zemědělství. Ta evropská cesta k udržitelnosti, ta bude náročná především z hlediska časového. V mnoha ohledech bude i těžko dosažitelná a především finančně náročná. Na tom se shodli včera paní docentka Jaroslava Ovesná z Výzkumného ústavu rostlinné výroby, Hagen Dienbostel z KVS Zád, Marek Kumprecht ze Spolku pro komodity a krmiva Praha a nebo pan doktor Jiří Lehejček z České technologické platformy pro ekologické zemědělství IFOAM Organics Europe. My jsme tedy včera projednali celou řadu témat, diskutovali jsme o mnoha klíčových otázkách a čeká nás totéž opět dnes. My se zaměříme tentokrát na témata, jako jsou zemědělství šetrné ke klimatu a dopady klimatických změn, aplikace nových genomických technik. To bylo jenom takové velmi stručné shrnutí. včerejších událostí. Teď už mi ale dovolte, abychom se podívali do budoucna, a to společně s prezidentem Agrární komory České republiky Janem Doležalem, kterého tady mezi námi vítám. Dobrý den. Jenom mi dovolte opět krátce představit Jana Doležala, který působí v čele Agrární komory České republiky. Je to tedy nejvýznamnější tuzemská zemědělská profesní organizace. On je v jejím čele 2 roky. Tuto organizaci předtím zastupoval při nejrůznějších jednáních v Bruselu. Sám vyrostl na rodinné farmě a říká, že zemědělci mezi sebou navzájem nesmí hloubit příkopy, ale naopak musí stavět mosty. No a to též platí i ve vztahu s laickou, tedy spotřebitelskou veřejností. Pane prezidente, prostor je váš.
Dámy a pánové, dobré dopoledne. Dovolte mi, abych vás pozdravil jménem svým i jménem Agrární komory České republiky, která zastupuje aktivní a produkční zemědělce v České republice. Nevím, jestli je v tuhletu chvíli připravená prezentace, už ji tady vidím, děkuji. Super. Já jsem si připravil takovou krátkou prezentaci, doufám, že se o ní moc tady nerozmluvím, abych zbytečně jaksi nezdržoval program na téma udržitelnost z pohledu zemědělců. Jenom krátká osnova a pojďme se podívat na to, jak třeba udržitelnost vnímají určité definice, jak ji vnímají zemědělci samotní, to je ten bod číslo 1. Pak se pojďme podívat na to, kde jsme z krátkodobého hlediska, protože přece jenom my máme tendenci vnímat takové ty disproporce mezi těmi hlavními pilíři udržitelnosti, především z toho krátkodobého hlediska. No a pak se podíváme, kam tady v tuhletu chvíli míříme, možná se tam dostaneme, možná se tam nedostaneme, uvidíme, jak se bude vyvíjet ta evropská debata, no a pak se pojďme podívat tedy, jak z toho případně ven. Když se podíváme na udržitelnost, já jsem to tady tak trochu nakousl. Existuje takzvaná ta klasická definice udržitelnosti, která se používá od 80. let minulého století, tedy že trvalý udržitelný rozvoj je takový, který naplňuje současné potřeby společnosti a zároveň tedy neomezuje schopnost budoucí generací naplňovat své vlastní potřeby. Teď je téma udržitelnosti, dá se říct, úplně všude kolem nás. Je to jedno z nejčastějších slov, pokud se podíváme trošku pod kapotu takzvané Evropské zelené dohody. Přesto vlastně definici udržitelnosti jako takovou Evropská unie v tuhletu chvíli nemá, i když se přesto o ní samozřejmě diskutuje. Já jsem si tady vybral jenom pár takových slov, které se dneska vlastně kolem udržitelnosti nějakým způsobem používají nebo se nějakým způsobem skloňují. My známe takové ty základní 3 pilíře nebo 3 dimenze, to znamená ekonomická udržitelnost, environmentální a sociální. Dneska se hodně mluví o slovech jako planeta, tedy planeta a její budoucnost z pohledu změn klimatu, lidé, tedy otázka toho, jak tady bylo řečeno, práva na potraviny, jestli vůbec něco takového, jak si by měla třeba společná zemědělská politika ještě dále sledovat, nebo by se více měla soustředit právě na tu environmentální rovinu. Hodně se začíná hovořit také o bezpečnosti ve smyslu nejenom tedy potravinové bezpečnosti, ale bezpečnosti, dá se říct, téměř vojenské, kdy vidíme, co se dneska děje na Ukrajině a vidíme, že některé režimy mají tendenci třeba používat i potraviny, dá se říct, téměř jako zbraň nebo takovou páku v politických vyjednávání. No a samozřejmě tady máme takový ten hodně používaný pojem prosperita. Tedy co je prosperita? Je to ekonomická prosperita, je to sociální prosperita, to znamená prosperita ekonomická víceméně pro všechny, nebo je to jaksi i prosperita budoucích generací, to znamená ta environmentální udržitelnost. Když se podíváme na tu praktickou definici z pohledu zemědělců, tak já jsem si tady dovolil takovou jaksi definici navrhnout, nebo spíše definovat ji z pohledu samotných praktických zemědělců, tak jak to vnímám já. To znamená mít možnost trvale vytvářet dostatečné množství produkce a tu realizovat za férové ceny. Ono tam v podstatě všechny ty aspekty nějakým způsobem jsou. Tedy jsem schopen vyprodukovat dostatek zemědělské produkce, dostatek potravin, jsem schopen to prodat tak, abych vlastně neskončil na konci roku v červených číslech. Samozřejmě pokud se budu potýkat s globální změnou, pokud budu mít ten rok sucho nebo naopak přijdou nějaké přívalové deště v důsledku právě klimatické změny, tak se mně pravděpodobně nepodaří vytvořit dostatek produkce. No a samozřejmě pokud tady budou jaksi tlaky, cenové tlaky, nějaké nelegální dovozy nebo něco podobného, tak se může stát, že nebudu moci realizovat tu produkci za férové ceny. No a samozřejmě se musím dlouhodobě chovat k té půdě a ke svému okolí tak, aby ta jaksi udržitelnost pohledu půdní úrodnosti z hlediska vůbec těch mimoprodukčních funkcí krajiny, které ale potom mají vliv právě tedy na schopnost tam něco produkovat, aby jaksi tyto věci zůstaly zachovány. No jaké jsou limity udržitelnosti? No velmi rychle, já jsem tady naznačil, samozřejmě změna klimatu, kupní síla, to je věc, kterou dnes vnímáme velmi citlivě, kdy samozřejmě ceny potravin nám letí vzhůru, jsou prakticky jedním z hlavních motorů inflace a my tady v podstatě narážíme, zejména tedy ve střední a východní Evropě, na to, že se některé potraviny, které jsme dříve považovali za potraviny základní, dejme tomu třeba takové máslo, začínají pro některé konzumenty stávat potravinami luxusními. To je zase samozřejmě potom věc, která má dopad na nás, zemědělce, protože takové, dejme tomu mléko zpracované na máslo, které je pro někoho luxusní, prostě v České republice není prodejné a my musíme hledat cesty, jak ho zrealizovat případně někde jinde a musíme takové mléko vyvést do zahraničí. No a samozřejmě další věc, která je limitujícím faktorem, o které se hodně mluvilo v minulosti a která teď trošku upadá do pozadí ve vztahu k těm klimatickým změnám, a to je generační výměna. Přece jenom práce v zemědělství je těžká, pro mnohé není atraktivní a pokud mladí lidé slyší, že v zemědělství je spousta problémů a možná někdy málo toho pozitivního, no tak samozřejmě se do tohoto oboru nehrnou a my se potom potýkáme s tím, že farmy vlastně nemá kdo nebo nechce kdo vůbec převzít. Kde teď jsme? Já to vezmu jenom velmi rychle, protože to je věc, kterou asi všichni víme. My vlastně čelíme extrémnímu nárůstu cen vstupů, ať to jsou pohonné hmoty, ať to jsou minerální hnojiva, ať to jsou částečně přípravky na ochranu rostlin, obaly, osiva a tak dále. A zvláště v živočišné a speciální rostlinné výrobě se tohleto promítá ještě citlivěji. Pokud se podíváme na tu klasickou polní výrobu, to znamená, že pěstuji pšenici, řepku, kukuřici, mák, soju a tak dále, tak ani tam v současné době není rentabilita úplně jistá, protože přece jenom máme tu obrovské náklady na jedné straně, mimořádné náklady za posledních 30 let, nikdo takové náklady nezaznamenal. No a na druhé straně tady máme velkou volatilitu, co se týče jaksi aktuální tržní ceny. Pokud se podíváme na dotační podpory, kterých se hodně hovoří, minimálně mediálně, tak tam se dozvíme, že jsme prakticky nominálně na stejné úrovni jako v roce 2014. Reálně jsme samozřejmě trošku někde jinde, protože tady máme tu velkou inflaci. Myslím, že jeden německý institut to vypočítal na nějakých 40% meziročně. No a pokud se bavíme o stejných penězích jako v roce 2014, tak tady máme prakticky reálně pokles někde dneska na úrovni 30 až 40%. Lze navíc v tom dalším období očekávat inflační tlaky na cenu půdy. Prostě blíží se nám hospodářská krize. Půda je pro mnohé jaksi konzervativní investiční nástroj, to znamená, není problém pro jakoukoliv investiční skupinu tu zemědělskou půdu nakoupit a pak ji zemědělcům pronajímat, samozřejmě za cenu takovou, aby se jim ten prvotní nákup nějakým způsobem vyplatil. A hodně se dneska hovoří ještě o jedné věci a to je jaksi využití zemědělské půdy pro zajištění energetické soběstačnosti. No jestli půjdeme tedy cestou nějakých fotovoltaik nebo agrivoltaik v nějaké obrovské míře a ono se to může stát, tak samozřejmě to zase bude vytvářet tlak na cenu půdy. Dokonce se hovoří o tom, že by vlastně fotovoltaické panely na zemědělské půdě byly vlastně formou veřejného zájmu, to znamená, že by bylo daleko jednodušší takovou půdu vlastně vyjmout ze zemědělského půdního fondu a dostat stavební povolení na takovéto stavby. Takže proto cena půdy pravděpodobně poroste. možná poroste i kvůli takzvanému uhlíkovému zemědělství, kde se dnes hovoří o tom, že zemědělci by měli, protože jsou sami v úzovkách zodpovědní pouze 6% skleníkových plynů, takže by měli těm 94%, tedy dopravě, průmyslu a těžbě a dalším odvětvím hospodářství pomoci a měli by tedy ukládat do půdy tedy CO2, což nejčastěji, tak alespoň jak to některé studie v tuhletu chvíli říkají, můžeme pomocí zatravňování nebo zalesňování, ne orbou, protože orba vlastně podle některých studií způsobuje naopak únik CO2. To znamená, bude tady velký tlak na to, aby se jaksi méně oralo, to znamená, aby se samozřejmě méně produkovaly polní plodiny, aby se třeba více zemědělská půda v Evropě zatravňovala, zalesňovala. Víte, že Česká republika má lesů poměrně dost, i když samozřejmě kůrovec s tím trošičku zamával, nicméně my v tomto jsme na tom jinak než některé jiné členské státy. Ne samozřejmě třeba Finsko, ale jinak než třeba Španělsko nebo některé jiné jižní státy. Co teď je jaksi takovým výsledkem té rovnice, nebo co naopak do té rovnice tak trochu nezapadá, je to, že se nám vlastně na základě společenské poptávky stále navyšují nároky na zemědělce, jsou tady různé požadavky, omezení, aktuálně třeba určité procento orné půdy úplně mimo produkci. Možná jste včera slyšeli o nařízení o udržitelném používání přípravků, tedy snižování přípravků na ochranu rostlin, snižování minerálních hnojiv, 25% do roku 2030 zemědělské půdy v režimu ekologického zemědělství. To jsou všechno věci, které budou zemědělcům částečně způsobovat problémy a které se potom budou odrážet právě v té udržitelnosti sociální a ekonomické. Samozřejmě to jsou věci, které jdou i nad rámec reformy SZP. Já jenom když se velmi rychle podívám na to, tedy co vlastně ta Evropská zelená dohoda v reálu přinese, protože o ní se hodně mluví, ale jaksi ty reálné vazby se někdy úplně až tak neopakují, tak dnes vlastně máme už ve fázi návrhu Evropské komise, a tedy to jsou věci, které budou projednávány na půdě Evropského parlamentu, několik legislativních aktů. Jedním z nich je nařízení o udržitelném používání přípravků na ochranu rostlin, což samozřejmě, pokud nebudeme mít alternativu formou tedy větší podpory precizního zemědělství, formou nějaké podpory nových genových technik a tak dále, tak to bude obrovský problém a je to věc, která se nedá udělat ze dne na den. Takže to samozřejmě bude mít potom vliv na ekonomickou udržitelnost podnikatelů v zemědělství, nejenom v České republice, ale v Evropě obecně. No, dále tady máme směrnici o průmyslovém znečištění, která vlastně bude sledovat jaksi počty zvířat na jednotlivých farmách. Tam, kde bude více zvířat, než se nejspíš tedy trialog nějakým způsobem dohodne, teď tady nevíme, jestli to bude 150 krav, nebo jestli to bude 300 krav, nebo ještě méně, tak tam bude muset zemědělec jaksi měřit emise skleníkových plynů a bude muset tedy činit kroky k jejich redukci. V tuhletu chvíli samozřejmě nevíme, co přesně taková směrnice bude nařizovat, nicméně je velmi pravděpodobné, že pokud budeme něco měřit, pravděpodobně v těch dalších letech budeme vyžadovat redukci, která nejsnažší cestou bude pravděpodobně znamenat redukci živočišné výroby, to znamená, já se těch krav prostě jednoduše zbavím, než abych investoval třeba do nějakých technologií, které by potenciálně byly samozřejmě extrémně drahé a potenciálně by mohly mít stejnou funkci. Cíle obnovy přírody, také téma, které má trošku návaznost na to první nařízení o udržitelném používání přípravků, protože tam se hovoří o úplném zákazu používání přípravků v takzvaných citlivých oblastech. Pokud si cíle obnovy přírody stanoví, že citlivé oblasti jsou 20 nebo možná více procent území členských států, no tak to samozřejmě znamená úplný zákaz používání přípravků na 20 nebo více procentech území. Já jsem slyšel dokonce v Evropském parlamentu, a je to zcela jaksi míněná záležitost, že by naopak ta citlivá území měla být třeba nějakých 60-70% území členských států, protože by se jaksi v nich odráželo dnešní vodní směrnice, to znamená vodní zdroje, vodní toky a tak dále, a že by se v ní odrážela nitrátová směrnice, to znamená takzvané ty oblasti zranitelné dusíkem. To by samozřejmě bylo jaksi dalekosáhlejší než ten původní návrh Evropské zelené dohody, který hovořil o nějakých 50% redukce. Někde jsme se možná dostali na 35, s tím, že u některých členských států se navíc bere historický progres. Tohle může být do budoucna samozřejmě obrovský problém. část krajiny zcela bez lidského zásahu, to znamená lesy, bez myslivosti, rybníky, bez rybaření a tak dále. Možná samozřejmě dobré pro biodiverzitu, ale pro nás jako zemědělce otázka jaksi likvidace, nebo tedy redukce zvěře, volně žijící zvěře a potom tedy samozřejmě výskytu škod na polních plodinách, to je věc, která nám dlouhodobě dělá starosti a naopak té volně žijící zvěře je čím dál tím více a samozřejmě čím dál tím více potom také škod na polních plodinách. Pak tam jsou samozřejmě mnohé další věci takzvaně v zásobníku a ty dále povedou pravděpodobně k snížení příjmů zemědělských podnikatelů. Jenom velmi rychle. Studie USDA v roce 2019, která se tak jako poprvé podívala na to, kam povede Evropská zelená dohoda, tehdy říkala, že pravděpodobně spotřebitelé v Evropě zaplatí o $1200 ročně za potraviny. Dneska jsme už pravděpodobně tuhletu metu překročili, pohybujeme se dokonce podle některých statistik spíše někde kolem hranice $2000, někde se hovoří dokonce o ještě jaksi vyšším nárůstu. A to je prosím pěkně ještě před aplikací právě tedy těch věcí, které vychází z Evropské zelené dohody. Tohle je vlastně pouze dopad potravinové lomeno energetické krize, kterou nám vlastně způsobila nebo spíš urychlila ta situace na Ukrajině. A to je ten další bod. Ono přece jenom my vlastně dlouhodobě jdeme v Evropě trendem snižování produkce. Začínáme se dostávat na úroveň, kdy Evropská unie nebude největším exportérem potravin na světě, kdy naopak bude některé potraviny muset dovážet. No a samozřejmě tohle to se nám dlouhodobě nasčítává a jak si ta situace na Ukrajině, ne že by tu potravinovou krizi sama o sobě způsobila, ona ji výrazným způsobem urychlila. Jenom když se podíváte na produkci pšenice EU v roce 2014, 157 milionů tun, 128 milionů tun v roce 2021. To znamená poměrně výrazný pokles. Odhaduje se navíc podle Koseralu, že by to v roce 2030 mělo být jenom 109 milionů tun a samozřejmě tohleto bude přispívat k dalšímu zdražování potravin. Jenom zase velmi rychle taková věc k zamyšlení. V architektuře existuje něco, k čemu se říká trojimperativ. To znamená, že nikdy není možné zkombinovat to, aby to bylo dobré, aby to bylo rychlé a aby to bylo levné. Já jsem si dovolil udělat analogicky takový zemědělský trojimperativ, to znamená to, co by společnost nejraději všechno chtěla, to znamená, aby dotace vůbec neexistovaly, aby byly nízké nebo nulové, aby byla nízká cena potravin, no, abychom samozřejmě měli co nejvyšší ohled na životní prostředí. A vlastně jako v té architektuře, tak i tady funguje bohužel takové dilema toho, že vždycky můžete mít jenom dvě věci zároveň. To znamená, můžete mít nízké ceny, nízké dotace, no a pak pravděpodobně budou zemědělci brát daleko nižší ohled na životní prostředí, protože přece jenom jaksi nebudou vázáni tedy těmi dotačními podporami k tomu, aby dělali to nebo ono. Nízká cena, vysoký ohled na životní prostředí, to většinou znamená vysoké dotace, protože musíte zemědělcům tohleto nějakým způsobem kompenzovat. No, pak je tady ten třetí scénář, tedy nízké či nulové dotace, vysoký ohled na životní prostředí a pak to všechno v podstatě vlastně musí zaplatit spotřebitel. To znamená, potom je jednoznačným výsledkem vysoká cena potravin a my se tam vlastně dostáváme, protože zase zpátky máme vlastně stejné podpory nominálně jako v tom roce 2014. Tohle vlastně nemohlo z pohledu nás zemědělců vlastně skončit jinak než tak, jak to v současné době vypadá. Pokud navíc dotace nesměřují na produkci nebo nejsou podmínkou dotací, tak k tomu dosažení nízké ceny nepomůže ani kombinace vysokých dotací, která kompenzuje vysoký ohled na životní prostředí. Prostě pokud chci po zemědělcích jenom, aby měli takové nebo takové pruhy a nechci, aby tam byly brambory, nebo tam byla cukrová řepa, nebo tam byl chmel, no tak samozřejmě nemůžu očekávat, že tyhle ty věci se potom na tom trhu nějakým způsobem objeví. Navíc je zde poměrně důležité časové hledisko, protože tady máme politický tlak, máme 4leté období na národní úrovni, máme 5leté období na té úrovni evropské. No a samozřejmě, jak říkám, my tu udržitelnost třeba vnímáme z toho krátkodobého hlediska, nicméně ta udržitelnost má spíše ten dlouhodobější charakter a proto je někdy velmi těžké si předsevzít nějaké dlouhodobé politické cíle, pokud nevíme, že vlastně u toho ještě ta současná garnitura nějakým způsobem bude. Jak z toho ven? Zemědělcům je třeba nějakým způsobem rozvázat ruce a dát jim právě do těch rukou účinné nástroje. Když se podíváme na ty účinné nástroje, tak to jsou jednoznačně technická řešení. Ať už to jsou nové genomické techniky, ať je to precizní zemědělství, ať to jsou nanopesticidy, biostimulanty a tak dále. Prostě věci, které mohou zemědělcům pomoci, které ale zároveň v tuhletu chvíli, alespoň z mého pohledu, mnohdy narážejí na legislativní překážky. Já si pamatuju jednu z konferencí Kopa Kožeka, myslím, že to byl dokonce kongres v chorvatském Šibeníku, kde byla zástupkyně Evropské komise a dostala otázku, kdy mohou zemědělci reálně využívat nové metody šlechtění. Kdy vlastně tohleto bude z pohledu zemědělců něco, co mohou běžně používat. Ta odpověď byla, pokud všechno půjde dobře, tak počítáme s nějakým horizontem 3 až 5 let. To znamená, my máme cíle Evropské zelené dohody někdy do roku 2030, poměrně ambiciozní, a máme tady naopak vlastně informaci, že se můžeme začít na nějaké nástroje obracet za 3 až 5 let. Máme tady nástroj precizního zemědělství, je to věc, která funguje zatím spíš na té komerční bázi. Musím říct, že dotační systém s tím zatím nějakým způsobem koketuje a ještě úplně nevíme vlastně, jak to uchopit. Někdo hovoří o aplikačních mapách, někdo hovoří o tom, že se budou podporovat nákupy přímo strojů, které umožní třeba variabilní aplikaci, nebo jsou vybaveny nějakou pokročilou technologií, která umožní právě tedy jaksi snižovat počet přejezdů a celkově tedy snižovat environmentální zátěž zemědělství. Uvidíme, já si myslím, že to je dobrá cesta, stejně jako věci, které zatím jsou v laboratořích, jako nanopesticidy, různé biostimulanty a tak dále. Někde samozřejmě jsou už i v praxi, ale zase někdy nám to naráží na ty legislativní překážky. No a zároveň v tuhletu chvíli, pokud se podíváme na to, jak nám vyrostly ceny potravin, tak je důležité podívat se na to časové hledisko. Přesně se můžeme dostat do té situace jako u toho českého másla, kdy prostě český spotřebitel to české máslo už v tuhletu chvíli kupovat nechce nebo nemůže, jednoduše protože mu přišel účet za energie, který je extrémně vysoký. Takže možná, že v tuhletu chvíli jsou samozřejmě zelené ambice chvályhodné, jsou asi potřebné, ale je třeba je nějakým způsobem přehodnotit a je třeba je případně posunout v čase tak, aby byly z hlediska zemědělců vůbec akceptované, aby byly splnitelné. No a poslední věc, otázka předsednictví. My v současné době jsme předsednická země Evropské unie, proto se tady vlastně dneska i potkáváme a vždycky se setkávám u laické veřejnosti s tím, že vlastně pokud je zrovna někdo předsednickou zemí Evropské unie, tak to všechno bude podle něj. No, tak samozřejmě to v Evropské unii úplně nefunguje. Spíše ta předsednická země jaksi má za úkol hledat nějaký kompromis mezi těmi ostatními členskými státy, což je samozřejmě velká příležitost, pokud se to správně uchopí, ale platí, že nelze roli předsednictví přeceňovat. Ale zároveň samozřejmě nelze ani podceňovat, protože je to možnost některá ta témata, prostě, jak se říká lidově, na ten stůl položit. Nicméně, co já alespoň vnímám za těch posledních x let, za které se pohybuji v Bruselu, je skutečnost, že Rada je v oblasti zemědělství prostě v defenzivě. I proto vlastně těch peněz je tam méně a jaksi požadavků na zemědělce je tam více. Je to dneska velké téma pro Evropskou komisi. Prostě Green Deal je dneska výkladní skříň minimálně pana místopředsedy Timmermanse a je to prostě věc, kterou veřejnost nějakým způsobem chápe, ale bohužel ji někde nechápe do úplně takové té celé hlouby a šířky. No a samozřejmě to je i téma pro část Evropského parlamentu, kdy zase environmentální otázky, sociální otázky a tak dále. Nicméně na samotné zemědělce a zemědělství se ne vždy úplně myslí při vytváření takových těch grandiozních cílů. No na druhou stranu ta situace na Ukrajině částečně, aspoň z mého pohledu, dostala do defenzivy Evropskou komisi a část Evropského parlamentu. Máme tady pro příští rok výjimky na určité záležitosti, které vlastně mají být od příštího roku povinné. A co je důležité, tak v roce 2024 nás čekají vlastně volby do Evropského parlamentu. A je možné, že cena potravin a vůbec tedy osud evropského zemědělství, aby to tedy ještě někdo měl a chtěl chuť dělat, může být důležitým tématem právě těchto voleb do Evropského parlamentu. A je dost možné, že nám ta krize, kterou tady máme, ta krize energetická, krize potravinová, krize hospodářská, pro mě lidé budou přicházet o zaměstnání, že nám bude do toho roku 2024 trvat. Takže uvidíme, jak ten příští Evropský parlament bude vypadat. No a samozřejmě pro nás nejenom jako nevládní organizace, které zastupují zemědělce, ale možná i pro země střední a východní Evropy, je důležité v tuhletu chvíli hledat spojence v radě. Pro nás samozřejmě je třeba hledat spojence v Evropském parlamentu nejen před těmi volbami, ale i po nich, protože přece jenom my musíme stále vnímat tu věc, že přece jen není počet zemědělců až tak velký v Evropě, je nás tady kolem 1 až 2% a přece jenom zbytek tady nějakým způsobem určuje, jak má zemědělství vypadat. My se to snažíme maximálně splnit, ale má to samozřejmě svoje limity. Takže, dámy a pánové, já se omlouvám, že jsem byl poněkud delší, nicméně to jsou věci, které si myslím, že by měly v té debatě zaznívat a že bychom skutečně měli hledat nějaký kompromis nebo takovou vyváženost mezi těmi někdy dlouhodobými cíli, které jsou nám prezentovány, a mezi tou krátkodobou udržitelností, protože přece jenom pokud si zemědělci nevezmou ty cíle jako vlastní, tak je nikdy nedokážeme uvést v život. Takže ještě jednou díky a přeji vám úspěšnou konferenci.
Dámy a pánové, já děkuji prezidentovi Agrární komory České republiky Janu Doležalovi. On říkal, je třeba zemědělcům rozvázat ruce, na něco částečně odpověděl ve svém proslovu nebo ve svém úvodním projevu, na něco naopak se ještě ptal dál. Tak uvidíme, co přinese doba, co přinesou následující měsíce a roky. Pojďme se teď zaměřit na první přednáškový blok dnešního konferenčního dne na zemědělství šetrné ke klimatu. Já všem přednášejícím připomínám časový limit 20 minut pro vaši prezentaci. Už teď jsme v mírném skluzu, ale já věřím, že to všechno zvládneme dobře. Dámy a pánové, dovolte mi, abych sem jako první pozvala paní Irene de Tovar z Kopa Kožeka. Irene de Tovar je politickou poradkyní Kopa Kožeka pro životní prostředí, klima a ochranu klimatu a udržitelnost. Je specialistkou v oboru mezinárodního a evropského obchodu a investic. Sleduje pravidelně vývoj agendy Evropské komise, a to už od počátku Zelené dohody pro Evropu. A v současné době zastupuje zájmy zemědělců a družstev v dokumentech, které se týkají klimatu, poskytuje poradenství pro toto odvětví a zasazuje se za jejich zájmy. So, Mrs. de Tovar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Hávova, for your presentation, and thank you to the Czech presidency for inviting Kopa Kožeka to participate in this event. Let me start just by thanking and congratulating the Czech presidency for driving such a challenging agenda in quite a complex political scenario. It is not breaking news to any of us here today that agriculture is a nature-based, climate-dependent sector, that it is exposed to multiple impacts from climate change. Now, we're talking about annual rainfall that has been decreasing. We're talking about drought and flooding. We're talking about risk of pests and diseases, erosion over soils, water management, and so on. You can ask any of, for instance, or Spanish farmers about the devastating effects of these droughts that they had this year, and they will tell you almost with tears in their eyes. But I'm sure that Mr. Doležal, if I pronounce that correctly, has many, many examples from Czech farmers. And unfortunately, it's not just climate-related challenges that we face in these days. We're also facing the increased cost of inputs, instability in the market, the supply in the market, and we're also facing a lot of pressure from legislative proposals and for political development in our agendas. And in this scenario, EU farmers have been progressively moving towards what we now call climate-smart practices. Yesterday, we heard several speakers, including MEP Halacek, talk about triangles, square, circles, and here I guess I have another triangle for you. What is a smart agriculture? It is enhancing resilient and livelihood and ecosystems. It is reducing and removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, and it is increasing productivity and incomes for farmers. And we need these three things. Mr. Doležal talked about sustainability and how we often focus on the environmental side of sustainability, but we tend to forget about that social and economic component. And we cannot forget that. It is completely unacceptable to think that sustainability is just about the environment. We had yesterday one of our speakers, Mr. Doležal, if I'm not mistaken, that reminded us that we had 8 billion people in this world to be fed, and we had 8 billion more coming by 2050. And if we cannot do that in a way that is productive and it's monetary viable, economically viable, then our farmers will not continue farming. So we need to keep this in mind. We also need to keep this in mind in the light of the Parliament's report about the farming structure in Europe. And we've seen that there is a huge problem with generational renewal. That means our younger farmers are less prompt, less inclined to take on the farmers' farms or actually to get involved into farming. And some speakers have actually referred whether agriculture is appealing or even sexy enough, as some put it. And part of that, at least that's what it comes from the report, is that all of these policy and legislative instruments that are putting so much pressure on the sector are not helping new generations get involved into that. So with that in mind, what can we do next? And before we move towards these needs from the farmers, and yesterday you asked Mr. Dematis to answer that question, I'll try briefly to do that. But before that, I promise that I will give you some examples of what our farmers are doing. And I'm just going to bring 3 examples from the ground, very easy ones. So I'm going to give you an example from Italy. It's Ms. Immaculada Migliaccio, that she is applying sensors and irrigation systems linked to an agrometeorological station to prevent the attack of harmful insects and to irrigate with precision. She also put like a pipe music system that enables crops to easily stimulate their stomata, which results in a reduction of the absorption, like a higher absorption of water. So it is very precise in the moment that the plants actually need it. Then we need, we also have another example from Belgium, Ms. Ines Teunis, which she implemented this specific feed-food ratio that results in a reduction of 30% of the methane emissions from her dairy cows. And let us not forget as well that we have agri-cooperatives doing a huge work and a huge progress in terms of, for instance, circularity. And here I'll bring you an example that is close to me because I am Catalan and it's a Catalan cooperative. It's the Camera Reserva from the Montsià, which they use rice husk to produce plastic. And this plastic can be used for the automobile, packaging, and furniture industry. And I know that yesterday we focused the discussion on laws on NGTs, but smart agriculture is more than just NGTs. So I wanted to bring these examples here today so we get reminded of that, all the efforts that they are doing. I'm not even going to start by talking about all the carbon farming projects that we are implementing here in the EU. And with that in mind, perhaps, if there are any EU officials here, to keep those efforts that the farmers are already doing when producing new policy instruments. The certification of carbon removals will be an upcoming instrument that it is likely to have a huge impact. Now, Mr. Doležal, you also talk about the Industrial Emissions Directive, and here we see a clear example of an instrument that is not helping achieve those environmental goals. It is true that we need to move forward and do more in order to reduce our emissions, but doing that doesn't mean that we need to put more administrative burdens to our farmers. We need to enable that technology to get on the ground and for it to be economically viable. And I guess that brings me to those 3 points that answer the question of what do farmers need. Farmers need policy and legislative instruments that are science-based, so please, whenever we have discussions on whether we accept or not certain innovative techniques, let's base it on science and not on the beliefs that the population may or may not have. And we need to ensure that EU is competitive in an international arena, because we cannot deny that we are international players after all. And we need policy instruments that are inclusive and respectful of all farming production processes. And here I'll refer back to what our US peers did say yesterday. It's not a fight against organic against conventional. All farming methods should be respected and should be included in these policies. We need to promote research and innovation and facilitate the dissemination of that information on the ground. So what I like to call closing the gap between the lab and the land. And here we've seen some EU farming projects that are very good at it, and I think that from Copa-Cogeca, what we can see, we would like to see more of that actually happening. And let's move away from these buzzwords and let's start talking terms that can be absorbed and can be easily implemented. And then finally, we need to ensure and enable financial incentives that support the implementation of these practices. I think that to sum it up, what we can say is that we need that upgraded version of Oliver's grandfather's toolbox. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Dámy a pánové, já děkuji politické poradkyni Copa-Cogeca pro životní prostředí, paní Irene de Tovar, za její slova. Tak slyšeli jsme další návody a tipy na to, jak by to v zemědělství mohlo fungovat dál a za jakých podmínek. Dovolte mi, abych teď ale pozvala sem k řečnickému pultu pana Francesca Mattina z Odrůdového úřadu Společenství agentury Evropské unie Community Plant Variety Office. A Francesco Mattina je prezidentem Odrůdového úřadu od letošního února, ale v úřadu jinak působí už přes 10 let. Je specialistou v oblasti práva Evropské unie a také v oboru práva duševního vlastnictví. A tématem jeho prezentace je podpora inovací rostlin a větší udržitelnosti v Evropské unii. So, Mr. Mattina, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to thank the Czech presidency for the opportunity given to the CPVO to share with you the experience and our perspective on sustainability and innovation. So I will go through the presentation with a very short introduction on the system, and then I'll focus on a study that we have recently conducted, which is totally fitting with this conversation and yesterday presentations. So what is the plant variety protection system in the European Union, and what is the role of our agency? Plant variety rights, or plant breeders' rights, as they are called in the UPOF world, are often forgotten, considered the Cinderella of IP rights when you compare it with big players such as patents and trademarks. Indeed, it's an important system of protection and fostering innovation in plant breeding. It's operational in the EU since 1995. It's a regional system. It means that it applies with a uniform effect in all the European Union territory. It's based on the UPOV Convention. The 91 Act is the last revision of the UPOV Convention. I may say that the UPOV Convention is part of the so-called acquis communautaire. No? It's part of our legal framework, and we do implement it in the European Union through a regulation. Through this system, we have to protect all plant genera and species, therefore varieties belonging to all plant genera and species. The right is not a patent, so please don't confuse plant breeders' right with patents. It's a sui generis system. It has a limited duration in time, can be 25 years or 30 years for certain crops. Recently, in 2021, the duration of the rights was extended for a number of crops, such as asparagus and flower bulbs. That was achieved in November 2021. Longer protection is given, for example, to potato varieties, trees, and vines. So as said, it's a unitary title, so it has a uniform effect all over the territory of the today's 27 member states of the European Union. Either you get it or you don't. You cannot cut the territory of the Union in sections, let's say. However, a breeder can choose to protect a variety locally, nationally, with a national plant breeder's right. However, it is not possible to have double protection. It means that if a breeder chooses to protect a variety at EU level, then he or she cannot protect the same variety, for example, in the Czech Republic. However, if you had already a national right before applying for community right, you could keep it, but you cannot enforce the national right during the life of the community right. So there are several advantages for this system to exist. As I showed, we are in operation since 1994, 1995. We are a mature organization following 27 years of operation. Everything is centralized in our office, which means less administration and less burden for the applicants. The system works in cooperation with national authorities. We don't have our centralized testing facilities to examine the varieties. We rely on national authorities, and we have a strong network of national authorities, 23 currently distributed in the European Union member state. Even in the Czech Republic, we have, apologies for the pronunciation, which is our testing facility in the country, especially focusing on cereals and oilseed rape. The scope of this examination office is cereals, grasses, potatoes, oilseed rape, and in the sector of fruits, apples mainly, and grapevine. And in the vegetables, onions, cabbages, French bean, and peas. So the distribution covers all environmental conditions of the European Union and climatic conditions in the different territory of the member state. So clearly we have set up a system which is, according to the words of Director General Sandra Gallina of DG Sante, kind of a diamond in the way it works in the European Union. I'm convinced that it is so. It's among the UPOV members the most, I would say, quality performing one in the European Union, relying on a strong partnership, as I said, with national authorities and expertise. We had more than 77,000 applications, granted more than 60,000 plant breeders' right, and today we still have more than 30,000 in force, meaning that the breeders continue paying for keeping the rights in the register and keeping the rights in force and valid. The spread of the sectors is on the slide. Of course, we had a trend of ornamental species, which is predominant in our register, followed by agricultural species, vegetable and fruit species. It varies slightly from year to year. However, the numbers are relatively stable. Now, linked to what we heard today already and yesterday, plant breeding, I would say, I would like to listen more to when you listen to the toolbox and what we need for a sustainable agriculture, we should start saying that we need a knowledge-based breeding. First and foremost, we need knowledge-based breeding. We need varieties. Farmers need good varieties that they can choose for their climatic condition. This is the basic condition. Then you can apply precision farming, digitalization, whatever. But if you don't have a variety which is good for a territory, you can't do it. So let's start from the very basic notion. Good varieties, incentives to breed varieties. To be mentioned that the breeding industry and the breeding sector is the sector in the EU with the highest percentage of investment on R&D. It can reach even 20 or 25% of the annual turnover of a company. This is the highest, even higher than in pharmaceutical sector. Most of the investment is kept in private hands. However, we do have also good experiences of breeding programs in the public sector, in public research institutes, such as in the Czech Republic, where, for example, you have the Institute of Experimental Botany, and they have protected 45, which is not a negligible number, apple varieties. I think that this slide is very emblematic of what we are talking about, and eventually Petra Jorasch, following my presentation, she will dig further into these notions. Now, going into this study, impact study, why we promoted the study, first of all. So we wanted to try to measure what is the impact of this plant breeding rights system in the EU, following the sustainability notion. So sustainability has a social and economic and environmental component, pillars. So we wanted to try to do this exercise. It was not done before. There are several studies already over there on the impact of plant breeding, but not on the impact of an IP system. So we presented it under the French presidency, just before the Czech presidency, in an event. And I would like to invite everybody to have a look. You can download for free the study in our website. You have the executive summary also available in Czech language, and then the study is in English. We had to make a choice on how to measure, so the economists that made the study had to make a choice on the way they could measure this in terms of crops, because you can see a huge diversity of sectors and crops. We reached the coverage of almost plus 80% of granted rights. You can see on the screen the crops and so the species for which we decided to make the evaluation, the assessment. Regarding ornamentals, they were treated as a combined crop due to the very large number of varieties, so it wouldn't be feasible to do it. Then so the economists, I have to say that this team of people working on this study was a joint effort between our office, also the breeder organization were involved, and a body of the European Union which is called Observatory on the Infringement of Intellectual Property Right, which is attached to another European agency which is called the EU IPO, based in Spain, dealing with trademarks registration. So in a nutshell, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but I can give you a very brief overview of the methodology that was used. In essence, it was done a kind of a negative process. Where would be us today without, if we hadn't have this system in place? Okay, and the result would be less, for example, less 6.4% for agricultural crops, or less 2.6% for fruits or vegetables, you see the number, and less 15.1% for ornamentals. What are the key findings in terms of economic contribution of the system to the EU? Through this innovation that got protection via a plant breeders' rights system, it has been possible to feed additional 57 million people with arable crops, 38 million with fruit crops, and 28 million for vegetable crops. I'd like also to stress in this respect that since it was the very first time that we approached this kind of study, and therefore there was a lot of discussion among the chief economists on this methodology, the best methodology to implement, these are conservative numbers. I mean, we wanted to be as much as possible close to reality without, in a way, inflating the numbers. And we know that Euroseeds has done similar studies in the past, and Euroseeds confirmed that these numbers might be bigger. We have been rather conservative for that reason. There is an additional added value in terms of GDP generated by the system in the amount of 13 billion euros and higher employment rates on average in the EU countries. Yesterday, it was already mentioned, I think, by the CEO of KWS and other speakers, the importance in terms of increase in yield. And this is a data that I can say it's confirmed also through our study. And it should not be much of a surprise for the sector, this result. In parallel, we have observed also a decline in the use of inputs, which is also thanks to plant breeding efforts and plant breeding game and objectives. As we heard yesterday, the major breeding game are resistances, for example, to pest and disease, drought, salinity in the soil. We heard from the professor yesterday. All this is reflected in the varieties that we get under the application for plant breeders' right in the CPVO. Again, a shortcut of the increase in yield for the individual crops in the period from 1995 to 2019, and the percentages per years. Now, the geographical origin, also this was tested. I'd like to stress here that one of the challenge of this study was choosing objective data that could be the solid base for analysis by the economist. So we used a number of databases, such as the database that we keep in the CPVO. And not a surprise to see that the top country for plant breeding innovation and plant variety right protection is the Netherlands, the country where there is the more of also understanding of the value and advantages of a system of protection. If I may say, it is not always the same in all the countries, especially when we deal with agriculture and vegetable crops. Most companies still today, among the smallest and the SMEs, they confuse the marketing system with the protection system. This is completely different aspects. With the marketing authorization and the national listing, you don't get protection. You can't give a license. You don't control your variety. You can't do it. Just simple like that. However, I often listen in the member state when we meet companies and SMEs that there is, again, a lot of confusion on these notions. And here also very important, this slide, and this is based on CPVO official data of our register, the size of the holders. There is the misconception that the seed sector and plant breeding in general is monopolized by a few multinational companies controlling also chemicals and inputs, etc. In order to counter-argue against this classico, I would say, we have seen that this is not the reality in our database, more than 90% are SMEs, and they hold more than 60% of the granted plant breeders' right. I mean, this is a significant number. I had a look also at the statistic of the Czech Republic, and I have seen that I think almost 90% in the Czech Republic are SMEs, so small or medium-sized companies. And a couple of public research institutes, such as the Institute of Experimental Botany, which I will visit later during this week. There is also a contribution to employment. This was also advocated yesterday on the impact of, and today by Irene, on the impact on employment and the necessity to guarantee also farmers' generation renewal. And we do believe that innovation can bring closer to the farmer what they need. So good varieties, once again, good varieties that they can implement together with other technologies. So in general, this has given more work in the European Union member states, more than 70,000 workers with an annual turnover of 35 billion euros. So on average, this is a very positive message for the impact of a plant protection system, which is there since 20 plus years. Of course, this study could not ignore the impact on environment because of the European Green Deal policy priority and implementing strategies such as Farm to Fork and biodiversity strategy of the European Commission. And therefore, it was also aimed at trying to measure what is the impact, also in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we believe those that are shown in the slide are those to which we believe the system contribute the most. Some examples of the key findings in terms of impact of the system on environmental objectives. The system indeed has contributed via plant innovation and plant breeding, which get protected through an IP right, an impact on a reduction of annual greenhouse gas emissions, reduction on the use of water. We all know that you cannot grow anything without water, but you have to make a good use of water, and we are observing more and more in the applications, for example, varieties which have a rooting system longer into the soil, and we are observing this more and more in our applications. And also the reduction of use of land and preservation, therefore, of biodiversity. So on average, there is a good impact in terms of environmental supporting achieving environmental objectives. I conclude with some key findings. Indeed, innovation is indispensable. It's a key driver, cornerstone of the system, and sustainability. It plays well for all the stakeholders in the system: breeders, farmers, SMEs in the EU. Don't forget also that SMEs are highly specialized companies, and we have a treasury of specialization in the EU. We must maintain, we must protect, we must keep this high specialization. We're going to deploy a system of subsidies and support for SMEs under the European Union IP Action Plan. It's called the SME Fund. We'll start this action in 2023. And we'll continue doing it in the next years, I hope, and I will plead for more funding and for more money destined to be given to breeding companies to support their R&D efforts. Again, there are a number of issues on the table. Former speaker today said we might aim at 3-4 years for now in the horizon to get access eventually to NGT. There are a number of legislative initiatives that are running in parallel in the European Commission right now, such as not only the new genomic technique, but you may be aware that we are revising also the plant reproductive material, so the whole package of seed marketing, old directives, which have to be updated also in the framework of the sustainability requirement. So this is also a big, let's say, legal, legislative project which is on the table. NGT, and also I have put in the list of priority also, I said we are in operation since 1994. The system overall works well, but our regulation is also aging, and we also need to look into it and to see if it is still fit for purpose or if we have to revise our founding act, which is our wish and our request with the European Commission in the next term of the European Parliament, I hope. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't pass my 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks to Francesco Mattina. But we have a little bit changes at this program, protože, jak už jsem včera říkala, konference je živý organismus a občas se nám přihodí něco takového, že musíme malinko pozměnit. Vím, že jste se těšili na příspěvek Petry Jorasch z Euroseeds. Navíc i Francesco Mattina ve své řeči říkal, že na něj paní Jorasch naváže. Ale dovolte mi, abychom se teď propojili až na druhou stranu planety. My se spojíme se Spojenými státy americkými, alespoň doufám, because our next guest should be Mike Paustian. Welcome to our conference, Mr. Paustian. Do you see us? Do you hear us?
Yes, I see and hear you perfectly. Am I coming in clearly?
Yes. Everything's fine. Mike Paustian is a farmer who has been using new genomic techniques in practice for many, many years, especially on his family farm in Wolcott in state Iowa in the United States of America. And Mike Paustian is already the 6th generation on this family farm. I'm right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and they currently grow corn and soya beans, and all the corn they grow is proceeded into pig feed. Although Mike Paustian grew up on a farm, he went out into the world to gain experience, earning a doctorate in microbiology at the University of Iowa, and working as a researcher at National Animal Disease Center. It was a difficult decision to leave the world of science and innovative technologies, but at the end of, and the choice fell on the family farm. Yes? I'm right.
Yes, that's correct.
And was it a hard decision for you?
Yeah, it was. I really love science. I love being in the lab, but at the end of the day, my wife is also from a farm, and we really wanted our children to have the chance to grow up on the farm like we did.
So you're in Iowa. I think you have 7 hours less than we here in Prague in Central Europe. How did you wake up?
Actually, a lot easier than I expected. So it's very early, but I'm excited to join you this morning.
Perfect. So we are really looking for your presentation. You can start. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to apologize for not being there in person with you, but unfortunately, this is still a very busy time of year here on the farm, and I was unable to be away long enough to take the time that it would take to travel there in person. So disappointed that I'm missing the chance to be there in person and visit with you, but hopefully another time it would work out better that I could actually be there in person. So appreciate the nice introduction, and my goal today is to just give you a quick snapshot of our experience on our family farm, which I think is fairly typical for most farms in the United States, and just give you a little slice of what our experience has been using biotechnology on our farm, and give you a picture of how the decisions we make regarding biotech are influenced by our goals for sustainability on our farm. So let's jump right into it. So as was mentioned, located here in Iowa, which is pretty much in the middle of the United States. You can see highlighted here. And my farm specifically is on the far eastern edge of Iowa. We're about maybe 15 miles from the Mississippi River, where I'm at right now. Right here on the far eastern edge. So Iowa is kind of in the heart of the Midwest, which is really the center of agricultural production, especially if you're talking about livestock and row crops such as corn and soybeans. So if I switch this map out for another map, this is showing corn production by county. And you can see that Iowa is literally the epicenter of crop production. If you took a map of soybean production, hog production, it would look very similar to this as well. So just a little bit about Iowa in general as a state. The economy in Iowa is very heavily dependent on agriculture. And that's because over 85% of the total land in Iowa is utilized for agriculture. So there's approximately 85,000 farms, the 98% of which are family farms. The average farm size is about 144 hectares. And just some production numbers so you can kind of get a feel for how much is produced here in Iowa. 48 million hogs are marketed annually. That's #1 in the United States. About 63 million ton of corn, 13 billion eggs. Both of those are also #1 for states. 13.6 million tons of soybeans. That's #2 in the USA. Illinois, which is right next door to us, is #1 just by a little bit. And then as far as exports, about $10 billion worth of agricultural exports every year are shipped from Iowa. California is #1, and that is mostly because California agriculture produces a lot of high value crops, produce and things like that make them #1 there. So specifically our farm, here's a little overview. This is what we refer to as the home farm. It's fairly typical for a farm, I would say. The oldest building here, you actually can't see. It's hidden in the trees here. I've got a smaller picture in the corner. This is the house that where I grew up and where my parents still live. This house was actually built by my great-great-great-grandfather, Frederick Paustian, who came over from Germany. Built this house and started the farm. So that was in the 1850s, and there have been Paustians living and farming here ever since. As far as other things you can see on our farm, besides the crops growing all around, we've got some buildings for machinery storage and maintenance, grain handling. As was mentioned, we feed all of the corn we raise to our hogs. So we have a feed mill here with storage for all the corn we produce in a year. We've got solar panels to provide some of our electrical needs. And then all these barns here are for hogs. And that's kind of the primary activity on our farm is raising hogs. They require obviously 24/7 care. The crops are more seasonal, but it all works together. And that's the reason why so many livestock are raised here in Iowa, is because of the easy access to food that's raised in the fields, but also it allows us to utilize the manure from the hogs as an organic fertilizer for growing those crops. And in my lifetime, we have moved from having some pigs outdoors to moving all of our pigs indoors. And part of the reason for that is here in Iowa, it can get as cold as minus 20 degrees Celsius in the winter, and we can reach almost 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. And so to keep our animals comfortable in those extreme temperatures, we've chosen to bring our pigs indoors in climate-controlled buildings where we can more easily keep them comfortable with computer-regulated environmental systems. So you can see a couple of pictures here of what it looks like inside our livestock facilities as well. So in total, we farm about 560 hectares, which makes us somewhere in the medium-sized farm, more or less. Farms are getting bigger all the time as fewer and fewer farmers are coming back to farm. And so that's just been a natural progression that's happened over the years. So as was mentioned, I'm the 6th generation to work on the farm. My kids would represent the 7th generation if they choose to return to the farm. And really that gets at what my main goal on the farm is, that I view myself as a caretaker. The generations that came before me have built the farm to where it is, and now my responsibility is to make sure the farm is in better shape than it was when I started, so that future generations will have the opportunity to farm as well, if they so choose, and to make sure that our land is in better shape and is resilient for the future. So you can see here we have pictured 4 of the 7 generations. My grandfather, who's no longer with us, is pictured here. And I've always thought it was fascinating. In his lifetime, he went from literally farming with horses to farming with 460 horsepower tractors that can steer themselves using satellite navigation. So just you think about the progress and the development that's happened in just one person's lifespan, and it really is mind-boggling. So my father is pictured here on one of our older tractors that was used when he was younger, but now is just fixed up as kind of a toy to drive around. And then you see my family pictured here. My wife and I have 3 kids, the oldest of which is now at university studying agricultural engineering. So definitely interested in agriculture. Whether any of them end up back on the farm remains to be seen. But like I said, that's my job right now, is to make sure that the farm will be here for them if they so choose. So getting into the meat of the topic today, talking about sustainable agriculture and how biotech helps us reach those sustainability goals. And really, I think of it as a toolbox. You know, having a hammer by itself is very useful. You can do a lot of things with a hammer, but if we want maximum flexibility and ability to adapt to different conditions and different situations, I'd much rather have an entire toolbox full of tools. And really, that's how I view biotech. Biotech is one additional or several additional tools that we can add to our toolbox and use if the situation warrants it. So let's get into that a little bit. One common misconception that I hear from folks is that you know, with biotech, farmers are forced to plant it and have no other options and things like that. And the reality is very different. So I know the printing is very small here, but what I really want you to get from this is This is an excerpt from a seed catalog from a regional seed company that we buy seed from, Wiffles Hybrids. And the point I'm trying to make here is that we have access to just as many non-GMO hybrids as we do biotech hybrids, and it actually kind of breaks down into a couple different categories. So we have non-GMO. We have what I'm calling old biotech, so older traits that have been on the market longer. And then we have new biotech, which are the latest collection of traits that are available in corn hybrids. And so they exist on a spectrum price-wise also. The non-GMO hybrids would be the cheapest. The older biotech would be a little more expensive, and the newer biotech would be the most expensive ones. But the point here is that producers have access to a wide range of options with and without biotech traits, and they pick which of these types of varieties work the best for their farm and their goals and their situation. And this is just one company's offerings. We generally buy seed from at least 5 or 6 different companies every year, and they all offer a similar mix of hybrids. So as far as what traits are currently available for biotech crops, herbicide resistance is one of the most common, above ground insect resistance, below ground insect resistance, combination of both of these, above and below ground, and also drought tolerance. So what's important to note here is that to date, all of these traits essentially are protecting yield and in some ways adding management tools, right? So none of these traits are actually increasing our yield. They're just helping protect the yield potential that's there. And that's what producers have found very attractive. It allows us to mitigate some of the risk of farming, risk due to, for drought, it's risk due to environmental conditions. For insect resistance, it's a resistance to pests, and for herbicide resistance, obviously that's a big help with managing weed pressure. So that's what's currently available now, and I'm just going to give you kind of a snapshot here of how that all fits together on our operation. So these are some pictures from fields around our farm, where we've worked our way to currently is no-till corn and using cereal rye cover crop on that. And so in October, after the previous crop is harvested, we come in with a drill, we seed our rye cover crop. You can just see it starting to grow here, a little bit of green popping up through the corn residue from the previous crop. Jump forward to April, that rye is now grown and spread throughout the field. We come in, this is right after the planter has been through. We have the planter clears off the row where the next crop is going to be planted, whether it's corn or soybeans, and the rye is allowed to continue to grow. So we're planting into the growing rye. After the corn has had a chance to get started, we'll come in and terminate the rye using herbicides. So this is where the biotech traits play an important role. It would be very scary to plant corn into growing rye if we did not have confidence that we would be able to terminate that rye, because obviously that rye has a head start and would compete with our corn, and our yields would suffer. Having the biotech tool of herbicide resistance built in to our corn gives us confidence that we will be able to get that rye terminated and not hurt our corn crop. And the other area that biotech plays a role in this system is with the no-till. So we've done no tillage on this field, and actually we do no tillage on any of our fields now. And one of the big tools we're utilizing there is the Again, the herbicide resistance for weed management, we don't have to go in with tillage to take care of our weeds. We can use herbicides. Sometimes we're using herbicides that are related to a biotech trait, and sometimes we're using herbicides that don't have anything to do with biotech traits. At the same token, we're able to manage our insect pressure with some of the insects that we're concerned about using the biotech traits rather than needing to use insecticides. So by May, you can see here the rye is dead. It's formed a nice mulch here between the growing corn rows. And this actually allows us to lower our total herbicide usage, because now we've come in with one herbicide pass, the rye is dead, it's smothering out any other weeds that might be trying to grow out here, and so that allows us to actually use less total herbicide. And here in June, you see the corn is now off to a great start. You can still see some of the dead rye in between the rows here. So overall, some of the impacts of using biotech crops on our farm, as I mentioned, we've been able to reduce, and in our case, completely eliminate tillage, which that has helped us reduce our fuel usage, which is especially valuable when in times of high fuel prices like we are in now. It's also allowed us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We've recently worked with an independent agronomy firm, and they've taken the data from our farm and calculated that we are actually a net sequester of carbon on our farm using the current practices that we are. So that's encouraging to hear that the changes we're making are getting us headed in the right direction as far as our sustainability goals. As I mentioned, we've been able to reduce, or in some cases eliminate, our insecticide usage thanks to the biotech traits. We've been able to reduce our overall herbicide usage. And this last one is one that I really want to highlight that gets lost in the conversation sometimes, is that because of our confidence in the protection provided by the biotech traits in our crops, and our ability to protect our yield potential to some degree, we've been able to reduce pressure on marginal cropland. So what I mean by that is we're confident that we're going to get enough production on our acres that are most suitable to row crop production, that we're able to take some of our other ground that is less suitable to crop production and put it into restored prairie or permanent grass and things like that do a better job of conserving the soil and utilizing the resources. And this is, if you magnify this on a national scale, that has the potential to take a lot of marginal acres that really are not well suited to row crop production, keep those out of production and in more conservation practices, which I think is a net win for both farmers and for the environment as well. So when you think about crop production and crop breeding, traditional crop breeding is not going to be replaced by biotech, right? That's still the foundation of that all of this is being built upon. I mentioned the regional seed company that we work with, one of them, they have not developed any actual biotech traits. They do conventional plant breeding, and then they license the technology and insert that technology into some of their most promising hybrids. So we're not going to get away from that anytime soon. And for the traditional crop breeding, it's always going to be focused on yield, plant health, and disease resistance. Those are kind of the main targets. That's what producers are desiring, and that's what's going to pay the bills at the end of the day. And so if we want other traits in our crops, that's where biotech comes into play. So if we want improved yields, improved stress tolerance, nitrogen utilization, water utilization, improved nutritional content, storage and handling of grain, disease resistance, oil composition. All of those things are potentially things that could be added, and I would love to see many of these added into the crops that we raise. But if we rely solely on traditional plant breeding, it can be done, but it's going to take a long time, right? So if we have a virus-resistant plant and we want to cross it with a high-yielding plant, we can do that and repeat it again and again and again, and eventually we might end up with a hybrid that is both high yield and virus resistant. Alternatively, using genetic techniques, whether you're talking transgenes like what we traditionally call GMO, or talking about NGTs such as gene editing, we can just simply take that resistance gene, or make a very specific single nucleotide change or a small deletion, and directly put that into a high yielding hybrid, and skip a whole bunch of steps in here and go right to our desired trait. So really, I view NGTs as simply accelerating traditional plant breeding. And it's important to keep in mind that we have, when we do traditional plant breeding, we end up with a lot of genetic changes that are maybe not desirable, and at the end of the day, it's just about how quickly we want to make progress on our crops. And for me as a producer, I'd like to see us make faster progress, because a lot of these traits could help us solve some of the challenges we're facing on our farms. So what's on the horizon as far as NGTs? The pink pineapples are already here, so you can probably find those in a store if you look hard enough. But as far as things that are maybe a little more interesting for me, healthier soybean oil. There's already a gene-edited soybean that's on the market, has been approved in the U.S. That has a modified oil composition that's healthier. Salt-resistant rice is in development. Disease-resistant tomatoes. The non-browning apple has recently come to market. Drought-tolerant soybeans, mildew-resistant wheat. This is just a small sampling of a lot of the work that's currently ongoing now. Will all of these make it to commercial production? That remains to be seen, but the potential is there for really a revolution in our plant genetics, in my opinion. Of course, you have to have a proper and appropriate regulations in place for the technology to be utilized. And so this is where there's currently a big difference between the United States and the EU right now. This is just kind of a scorecard for the current state of gene editing regulations. So this would be for NGTs, and you can see the United States is down here for crops rated a 10, which is because there's currently a clear regulatory pathway for gene-edited plants. The USDA has determined that gene-edited plants that are essentially indistinguishable from traditionally bred plants would not be subject to any further regulation. And so you see the EU is down here, and then we have kind of a spectrum in between. I'll just point out that South America in many ways is leading the charge on NGTs. They are rapidly adopting both crop and animal technologies to meet their production challenges on their farms. And so we'll briefly pivot here a little bit and briefly talk about livestock as well. In the United States, the regulatory environment is a little more muddled as far as animals. The FDA and the USDA are kind of having discussions about who would be most appropriate to regulate it. And currently, the FDA is handling the approvals of gene-edited animals. And so there's still some kinks, I think, that need to be worked out in the system, but we're moving in a good direction there, I think. So when we're talking about swine production, some of the challenges we're trying to face there are, as far as diseases, again, sustainability. That's at the forefront of many consumers' minds right now. Welfare challenges, and also consumers are telling us they want reduced antibiotic usage in animals. So those are some of the challenges that we're trying to meet right now. You talk about swine breeding, just like crop breeding. Here are some of the core selection traits: average daily gain, feed conversion. This is very important for when you're talking sustainability. We want animals that can very efficiently convert feed into muscle, and also mortality. So these are the core traits that traditional breeding is focused on, because these are the ones that at the end of the day pay the bills. So now when we're talking about additional traits that would be desired, my daughter Madeline here, she one of the traits she would desire would be if we could modify the pigs so they stay small and cute for their entire lives. And while I appreciate that pigs are very cute when they're small, there's not very much meat there, so I don't think we'd be very sustainable if our pigs never grew any bigger than that. So that'll remain on the wish list for now. But some of the things I'd like to see added would be heat tolerance, additional disease resistance and disease resilience, some certain behaviors, meat quality, and again, nutrient utilization would kind of be on the short list of some traits that I'd like to see added. On the horizon, what's kind of coming down the pipeline right now? Hornless cattle have already been developed using gene editing. Heat tolerant cattle have already been developed. That's with the slick mutation that is naturally occurring in some breeds, has been replicated in other breeds. The FDA has already approved that in the US, and they've also been approved like in Brazil and Argentina and some other countries. High yielding tilapia, again, taking a naturally occurring mutation and replicating it in production species. Hypoallergenic milk. Here's a big one that I'm interested in, PRRS resistant pigs. So the PRRS virus has a major economic impact on pork production. It can be economically devastating. We've had this virus on our farm. It's not fun to deal with. We've been fighting it for several decades now, and they're just because of the nature of the virus, there's not an effective vaccine that's been developed. But currently, there is a company working on pigs that are engineered to be PRRS resistant. So that obviously could have a huge impact on pork production. And also castration-free pigs. I know that's a big animal welfare concern. I know it is in the EU as well as in the United States. And for me personally, I can say that I would love to have pigs that would be free of boar taint, so we could leave them intact and not need to castrate the males. You know, not only is that a big improvement for animal welfare, but it would be huge labor saving for us on the farm as well. One point that I just wanted to make quickly is that agriculture operates in a global marketplace now, and so when we're considering the potential for using biotech crops or biotech animals on our farm, one thing that's very important to us is whether those crops and animals would be approved for export into the countries that we ship our products to. So this is just showing pork exports. So the pork from Iowa gets shipped all around the world, especially into Southeast Asia. And so as biotech crops have been adopted, one of the limiting factors there is, we need to have those biotech traits approved in our major export markets before producers are going to be willing to grow them on our farms. And so that's an important component of all of this, and it's important consideration. We aren't operating in a vacuum, right? We have customers all over the world, and we need to make sure that those customers are on board with the types of crops and livestock that we're raising on our farms. So going back to the sustainability toolbox, as I mentioned, using biotech has allowed us to implement no-till with cover crops. Plant breeding is still an important tool in the toolbox as well, traditional plant breeding. GMOs, so I'm using that as a catch-all for transgenic changes, and also biologicals as well. And this is something I just mentioned briefly. When we talk about biologicals, there's already some products on the market, like Pivot Bio has a Prove-N product where they've isolated a bacteria that actually is able to colonize corn roots and then fix nitrogen that it provides to the corn plant. So if you just, think a few steps down the road here, what would it look like if we had genetically modified bacteria that we added to our growing crop? So they aren't part of the crop itself, but they are synergistically growing with our crops and providing some benefits. So that's a whole nother aspect of NGTs that is worth considering. And so some of the tools that we're getting ready to add to our toolbox would be, gene edited crops and livestock, and also RNA interference. There's some of those products are just starting to come to market as well. So again, we're just collecting additional tools, and whether we choose to utilize them on our farm, that's kind of an individual farm decision. I know producers who grow entirely non-GMO crops. I know producers who grow some of both, and I know producers who grow only genetically modified crops. A lot of it just depends on your market, as I previously stated. You can usually get a premium for growing a non-GMO crop. But that comes with some trade-offs, because obviously there are some management tools that aren't available to you then. Since it was mentioned, we feed all of our corn to our pigs, so we have there's no premium for us for growing non-GMO crops, and so that's why we've chosen the direction that we have. And I want to leave you with this thought. When you're talking about ag biotech, I've kind of alluded to some of this, but I like to think of it as a three-legged stool, right? We need all three legs on this stool or it's going to fall over, right? We need science, so we need the scientific understanding of what genetic changes are possible and what beneficial traits those will result in. We need appropriate regulation in place. And this is kind of the situation that the EU finds itself in now. The regulations do not allow the science to move forward because there isn't a regulatory framework in place that would approve those products. But then also we can't forget about the consumers. At the end of the day, a consumer is going to buy the products that we're raising on our farm. And so we need consumers to accept biotech crops, we need appropriate regulation, and we need science all working together for biotech to be a useful tool on our farm. So final thoughts. On our farm, at least, we've been able to make substantial sustainability improvements in part by using biotech tools. There's many additional traits that we'd love to see incorporated into our crops and our livestock as we continue to face challenges to feed a growing world with while at the same time using fewer resources. I view biotech as being synergistic with traditional breeding. It's not replacing it, it's merely supplementing it, and in many cases rapidly speeding up traditional plant and animal breeding. We always need to keep trade considerations in mind, and we need to have approval in all of our marketplaces before we implement new tools. And the final thought is the whole concept of regulation based on the type of modification, right? Obviously, what we call traditional GMOs, we're talking transgenes, where we've taken a gene from one organism and moved it into another one. And so understandably, there's a certain amount of regulation involved to make sure that's safe and those products are safe. Now, when we start to talk about NGTs, like gene editing, now we're talking about making, in some cases, very small changes that in some cases are actually replicating naturally occurring mutations or deletions. And so, in my opinion, as a scientist and a producer, those types of changes are very different from transgenic changes and should be therefore regulated differently as well. But again, that's my opinion, but wanted to throw that out there for thought as well. So I've been happy to be with you this morning. Again, disappointed that I couldn't be there in person, but I hope this has been of use to you, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you really for a really comprehensive and impressive presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Paustian is still with us. So please, let's start with the questions for him. And please ask your question in English. So, who wanna ask Mike Paustian? I see the man over there. So listen, Mike. This is
Thank you.
Question
this is
for you.
Matthias from Belgian representation. I have a question on these GMO and non-GMO corn that is available for farmers. But I think the real question is how much of the farmers decide to take the non-GMO maize to grow instead of the GMO.
All right. Yeah, great question. So I think a lot of times it varies depending on your local market conditions. So in our area, we have several processors that utilize or are willing to pay a premium for non-GMO corn. And so there are some producers who choose to take advantage of that and will do that. But I would say I can't give you an exact percentage because it varies a lot just by different locations around Iowa and the United States. But you know, I would say most producers who do grow non-GMO crops are probably, I would say there's maybe 5 to 10% that only grow non-GMO crops. And there's probably 50%, well, not 50%, maybe 30 or 40% maybe grow some GMO crops and some non-GMO crops. But the majority are growing all GMO crops at this point. So again, it's mostly a market-based decision. The marketplace is kind of driving this. And if there's more demand and a higher premium being paid for non-GMO corn, then you'll see more producers for that given year may choose to switch and do some additional non-GMO production. But you know, non-GMO production involves a different set of management tools. And so not all farmers are necessarily equipped to do that. You know, for example, you know, weed control is a big issue for, you know, non-GMO production. And so, you know, like our farm, we don't even own the tillage equipment that we would need to manage weeds in a growing crop right now. We've chosen to just sell that equipment that we used in the past. But there are other alternatives available, whether you're talking, getting the flamethrowers out there and burning the weeds, or zapping them with electricity and things like that. So it's kind of, there's additional investments needed if farmers are going to switch back and forth between GMO production and non-GMO production.
Perfect. Thank you for your answer. Does anyone have any question? Yeah? The man here in front. And then please give a microphone to President Doležal.
Thank you very much, Mike. My name is George Schreiber. I'm from the Federal Food Safety Office of Germany. Thanks for your talk. I mean, it showed very practical how open US are for innovations. This is very different in Germany. We are normally very reluctant to innovation and changes. But you mentioned that you are very concerned with all these regulations in the country where your products might be exported. But if NGTs cannot be differentiated from natural crops, is it really a concern? I mean, why you are concerned? I mean, you can export NGT crops to any country with very, even if the country has very strict regulations.
Right. Yes, you raise a very good point, and that it's going to be increasingly difficult to separate, NGT crops from traditionally bred crops, as we're to essentially replicate naturally occurring mutations. So yes, that's an excellent point, and I think yes, you're correct that essentially those crops could be passed off as non-modified crops, and I think future regulations are going to have to take that into account. I think most, well, I guess I shouldn't say that. Excluding the EU, I should say, it seems like most other major agricultural producing countries are choosing to adopt regulations that essentially codify that any NGT crops or livestock that are essentially indistinguishable from traditionally bred crops and livestock are not going to be subject to any further type of regulation. I think because that essentially appreciates the fact that it's going to be very hard to distinguish them from each other. But that said, where my concern would be is if there are countries that for whatever reason choose to have more strict regulatory requirements in place, we could end up with some type of certification program where you have to certify that your crop was not is not utilizing NGTs or something along those lines. There may be additional documentation that is required from a legal standpoint to verify that you did or did not utilize NGT. So I'm optimistic that's not going to be the case, but it remains a possibility if some countries choose to not want to accept those types of products into their markets.
Thank you. And President?
Just a quick question. Thank you very much for joining us today. Hats off to waking up so early. As they say, farmers are early risers, so you have my admiration. Just a quick question. You were talking about using no-tilling technologies, and that's something that we need to opt here also in not only in Czech Republic but in the EU as a whole, connecting to the new common agricultural policy, which basically tells us that we can't till on 80% of arable land that we now utilize. So we will have to look to those technologies. But on the other hand, to successfully employ no-tilling technologies, you have to use glyphosate. So I don't really see the way that we are able to go no-till and no glyphosate in the future, which is something that will probably happen in the EU. So this will be a problem for us, and also we are supposed to reduce our overall plant protection products. And on the other hand, when it comes to NGTs or GMOs, it's a very hard regulatory field here in Europe. So that's what I was going to perhaps mention, and what I was going to really ask is that how do you deal with public opinion, or sometimes I would say public backlash, when it comes to things like glyphosate, things like GMO, or perhaps welfare and things like that? Do you have any special fund, or do you have any special farmers organization which does your PR to deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment and question there. I'll try to touch on a few things. You know, as far as your last question, as far as groups that we work with, yes, that's something that I've chosen to be personally involved in. That's one of the reasons I'm speaking to you today, is just because, you know, with my science background, it's something that I'm interested in, and something that I feel like I can try to help bridge that gap between production and consumers and science. But we work with several organizations in several different areas. You know, on the pork side, I work with the National Pork Producers Council, which is our national production organization. We've been involved with working on gene editing in swine, and working with some other nonprofit organizations that are designed to help educate and inform consumers about NGTs. I think we all recognize that mistakes were made in the rollout of the original GMOs. Those decisions were made without really consulting consumers and the general public. Most of the benefits were reaped by the producers themselves. So it was easy to convince us as producers that, hey, this is a great new tool that gives us a lot more flexibility and options on our farm. But we did not take that to consumers and explain to them how it could benefit them. And that's where we're still dealing with all this backlash on GMOs and on glyphosate, for instance, you know, because it's unfortunate that glyphosate has kind of gotten tied up with this whole GMO debate, where, you know, glyphosate is much safer and better for the environment than so many other chemicals that we can use. And it's unfortunate that it's been demonized to the degree that it has. But you know, my hope is that with the use of NGTs, hopefully we can perhaps develop different forms of herbicide resistance to other types of herbicides, so we won't be as dependent on glyphosate. You know, just as an example, on our farm, yeah, we do use glyphosate, but we also try to, for stewardship purposes, we try to rotate the types of chemistry that we're using on our farm. So, for instance, in our soybeans, we'll sometimes raise glyphosate-resistant soybeans, maybe for 2 or 3 years, and then we'll switch and we'll use soybeans that are resistant to a different herbicide, so that we don't develop weeds that are also resistant to those herbicides. So that, you know, that's kind of a whole nother aspect of this, is stewardship and maintenance of the effectiveness of these traits that are available. Yeah, I definitely appreciate your comments, and you're absolutely right that we need to bring consumers along with us on this journey to help them, understand. At the end of the day, it's a very small minority of folks that are absolutely against, biotech in crop production, in animal production. There's a sizable group of people in the middle who don't know that much about it, aren't necessarily against it, and if they had the right information, I think they would be much more accepting of the technology.
Thank you. Maybe good idea for your stool, Mike, because you told us about 3 columns: science, regulation, and consumers. So communication with consumers is the 4th column. So no one else has a question? Yeah?
Hello,
Okay.
thanks. This is Maria Teresa Bugo from the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Actually, my question is a little bit related to the previous question. So whether you can share any experience that you have with the consumers and how much of your choices in using biotech has been driven by consumers' trends. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that, would be great. Thank you.
Yes, sure. As far as GMO crops are concerned, biotech crops, there really has not been a lot of consumer concerns about that. They've been on the market long enough here in the United States that everyone has grown used to them to some degree. I think occasionally things will still pop up here and there, but for the most part, it's genetically modified crops have gained general acceptance here in the United States, and I think I suspect that will continue as we're starting to see some products such as the pink pineapples or the non-browning apples. I think there's some tomatoes that have been approved now that have more lycopene in them. As we see some of these produce type crops come to market that have been engineered to have direct benefits to the consumer, I think that's going to help, I hope, with acceptance of other genetically modified crops, as consumers can say, hey, I can buy these apples and they aren't going to turn brown when I cut them, and they're not going to waste as much food. There's some big benefits there as far as, food wastage is a big deal as far as sustainability goes. So if we can mitigate that, if we can improve, some of the nutritional content of some foods, that could go a long ways to gaining overall acceptance of other gene edited crops. On the animal side, I think the reason why that has lagged behind plants, I think, is because that is something that's newer. For whatever reason, I'm really not sure why, but consumers seem to be a little more concerned about genetically modified animals than they are about genetically modified crops. I think a lot of that has to do with them just not being used to the idea of that. But also, animals are obviously much closer to humans than plants are, and so maybe that's where some of the concern comes from as well. But what I found in what I've been involved with and some of the groups that I've been involved with that are working on helping consumers understand more about NGTs especially, is that most consumers don't necessarily want to understand all the science behind this, right? They don't know, they don't really care so much. What they want is to know that the people who are working on this, the scientists who are working on this, the producers like me that are raising these crops and animals on their farms, they want to know that those people share the same values they do, right? That's what I think is the most important thing. I'm not sure where this phrase came from, but it's what stuck in my head with this. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. And that's really, I think, where we need to work on this. If we can gain public trust, that they trust the people working on this, share their values, their concern for the environment, if they trust that the people who are making the regulations for this share their concerns, I think that will go a long ways towards gaining consumer acceptance of these technologies.
Thank you for your words, Mike. Thanks for your answers. And that was the last answer, and before it, last question. Thank you for being with us at this International Scientific Conference. Thanks a lot. And are you going to sleep? No.
Yeah, I feel pretty awake right now, so we may just get an early start on the day and get some more done.
Okay, so we wish you a good day. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Dámy a pánové, tohle byl opravdu dlouhý příspěvek, ale myslím, že jsme si to zasloužili, tyhle velmi zajímavé postřehy. Tímto se ještě jednou velmi ze srdce omlouvám Petře Jorasch, která byla tak laskavá a počkala se svým příspěvkem až na tuto chvíli. Dámy a pánové, doktorka Petra Jorasch je manažérkou inovací v oblasti šlechtění rostlin v Euroseeds. Je to doktorka molekulární biologie, špičková a mezinárodně uznávaná odbornice ve svém oboru. Zaměřuje se především na oblast osiv, šlechtění rostlin, přístupu ke genetickým zdrojům rostlin a jejich využívání a ochrany duševního vlastnictví. Tak, Mrs. Jorasch, the floor is yours. We are looking forward for your contribution.
Good morning. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to contribute to this conference. Many of the aspects I would like to touch upon have already been addressed in previous talks, but maybe you can take my presentation as a kind of a wrap up of different aspects that have already been addressed, and to also, let's say, provide the specific perspective of the plant breeding and seed sector in Europe. I'd like to start with maybe a short introduction. Who is Euroseeds? Euroseeds is the European representation of the seed and breeding sector. We have national associations as members as well as companies, and we are representing the whole seed and breeding, let's say, value chain. So from research over breeding, seed production, seed treatment and cleaning until seed trade. What you can also see from that slide, so we are not restricted to the European Union with our membership, so we also have national association members from countries which are either no longer belonging to the European Union, like UK, but also countries like Turkey and Ukraine and other European countries that kind of have let's say, at least an intense relationship also to the European seed and breeding sector. A few facts and figures about the sector. So it's a rather small sector when you look at, let's say, employees. Nevertheless, since we are at the beginning of the agricultural value chains, the products that our companies produce, of course, have a big impact on agricultural production. The figure which I have highlighted here, and that has already been addressed by Francesco, it's the annual R&D spending of our sector, which is up to 20% overall crops and companies, and that's really a high figure. So we are a very innovative sector, and this is also, of course, important when we talk about new breeding techniques and new breeding innovations, because our companies really put high investments into R&D. A few figures on the varieties which are currently available on the market, and this is not the same figures as presented by Francesco. That's the varieties which are listed on the common catalogue of varieties and which are, let's say, marketable in the European Union independent of their IP status. And each year companies provide more than 3,500 varieties to the EU market, so available for EU farmers, and that's not only agricultural crops but also vegetables, and in total we have more than 40,000 varieties on the common catalogue, so it's a huge diversity of crops available to European farmers. This aspect has been addressed in previous talks already as well, and I think this slide very nicely shows that we have still yield increase and productivity increase in crops, and but it's decreasing. So when you look at the left-hand side, so the dark green columns, it's the yield increase between 1961 and 1990, and the light green color shows the same yield productivity increase between 1990 and 2007, and you can see for the crops listed here, it's slowing down. So there is a challenge, and that's specifically coming, of course, from environmental challenges like pest pressure and also climate impacts, of course. And so if we want to keep up with contributing to yield increase, we need to innovate for in plant breeding. The same is true when we look at the, let's say, not the global figures, but this is here European figures. So in total, over the past 20 years, plant breeding has contributed to 66% of the productivity growth in Europe. So 2/3 goes back to genetic improvement. The rest is going back to other agricultural inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, but also, of course, other agricultural technologies. And that means it's 1.16% yield increase per year over all crops, over all European countries. That is going back to genetic improvement. But we, of course, we face challenges, and this has been addressed yesterday very nicely in several presentations. So we have the goals of the Farm to Fork and biodiversity strategy, and that, of course, puts additional pressure on productivity in the EU, not only by reducing agricultural inputs, but also by having the goal of getting some of the productive farmland out of production, and also, of course, increasing organic farming, which is still not yet that productive as conventional farming. And we did a study, and overall crops and overall European countries, the impact of the goals of the Farm to Fork strategy on productivity might be that we will face a productivity losses of more than 20% when all these measures will be implemented by 2030. And that's, of course, let's say, a huge impact, and if we consider that some of the other agricultural inputs will be reduced, so plant breeding and genetic improvement will get even more important. So not only maybe 2/3 of the productivity gain will be going back to plant breeding, but even more in the future. We also did some, let's say, calculations. What does it actually mean? So if we would go back, if we would have this more than 20% impact on productivity, and we would continue with plant breeding at its current pace, so meaning the 1.16% yield increase over all crops and per year, then we would see the following scenario, which is on this slide. So we would not be able to compensate for those productivity losses until 2030, when the full Farm to Fork strategy is supposed to be implemented. And I think it was pointed out yesterday, it's only 7 harvests left until we are there. So it's coming rather quickly. And even if we look at 2040, we would not be able to compensate for all crops, so specifically wheat, oilseed rape, and other oilseed and pulses will still be lagging behind if we impose all these measures on European agriculture. So what does it mean? So if plant breeding should help compensating, we need to speed up. And how can we do so? Of course, by innovating and by having all the tools available that we need in plant breeding to speed up. And some of them are those new technologies that we call NGTs in the European Union, and that are called new breeding techniques, let's say more on an international level. And it was mentioned by Mike in the previous talk, so it's rather a toolkit, and it's an evolution of different technologies that have been created specifically after Gregory Mendel has discovered the laws of genetics around 150 years ago. Plant breeders have started innovating because plant breeding became a real science, and we have different technologies that have been applied over the past 100 years, let's say, and the latest ones of those are which we highlighted here as precision breeding, and which are mainly the NGTs, which we discussed already earlier during the conference. And while we have all the other tools more or less available besides genetic modification in a classical sense, those new breeding tools are not yet available, also because we have these regulatory restrictions since the European Court of Justice ruling in 2018. And what the slide should also show, and that was mentioned also by Mike in the previous talk, it's not about replacing one technology by the other, but adding to the toolbox so that a plant breeder is able to choose the tool which is most suitable to solve a specific problem. The basis of plant breeding is still crossing and selection, and those new tools can help accelerating breeding, but they are not replacing all the other tools. So where can those new tools play a role? And this is kind of the breeding circle which we have drafted here, and the figures which are in this circle, they represent the number of years it can take for the different steps in the breeding circle. It's not an absolute figure, so depending on where you start, with what kind of pre-knowledge you have, you might save some time, but it can take up to 25 years from basic research up to a variety that can be sold to farmers. And you can use those new tools at different steps at the breeding circle. So you can start with basic research, gene discovery research, where those tools can play a role. Then, of course, translating this basic research results into crops in public-private partnerships, for example, specifically when you look at small and medium-sized companies who are interested in collaborating also with public science in order to keep up also in research and breeding. But then also during variety development, when you look at improved germplasm already, where you just want to add a specific trait that is valuable, so you can also use those tools there. And so that just means those new technologies, they help speeding up breeding at different stages so that we can save time to get to the market earlier with improved varieties that can help farmers. And this is just a very also conservative calculation. So if we look at cereals, for example, where we have a general estimated breeding time of 10 to 12 years for a new variety, and if we could only save like 2 years in breeding with those new tools, that would mean 18% earlier progress on the market, and that would in fact mean that we would have an additional yield increase until 2040 of 2.6%. So that could already help to provide extra food. We avoid greenhouse gas emissions because we have less pressure on farmland, and we can maybe even keep some of the land out of production. So that was also mentioned by Mike in the previous presentation. So saving natural habitats for nature and not putting them under production. So there are various means by which saving time in breeding can contribute to sustainability and to the goals of the farm to fork strategy. This slide just should show, independent of specific breeding methods, how plant breeding in general can contribute to the different aspects of the farm to fork strategy. So it's not only about increasing yield, of course, it's about saving yield by increasing resistance breeding, for example, nutrient use efficiency, but also providing additional choice for green foods, vegetables, more people becoming vegetarians, so alternatives in for example, example, vegetable production. But then also, if you look at other sustainability aspects which do not realize on farmers' fields, but maybe later in the value chain when it comes to processing of certain products, where you can maybe save energy because you have already a better processing quality. Also, those aspects, of course, contribute to the Green Deal and to the Farm to Fork strategy. And they are not less, let's say, that visible for the consumer on the one hand and the farmer on the other hand, but still they are making an impact on being more sustainable, for example, in view of chemicals and energy that is needed to process certain crops. When we look at the NGTs, so there are different studies from public science, but also an internal survey which we did within our membership, where we asked our members, so in which kind of crops and trades are you interested using those new technologies? And what you can see from this slide is that independent of if it's public science application or applications of those technologies in private breeding, companies and public scientists are interested in using those technologies for many different crops. This is not listed here, but also many different traits, like the ones which have been reflected on the previous slide, but also the ones, so just generally listed here: agronomic value, food and feed quality, biotic stress resistance. So it's not only about herbicide tolerance as is claimed by some, let's say, critical opponents. It's really the diversity of traits which can be addressed and are of interest for companies to address them with the new technologies. This is a different kind of presentation than the one that Mike just put on screen. So it's let's say the global map of policy developments for specifically those NGTs around the world. And what has already been reflected in the previous talk and maybe is a bit more visible here from that slide. So we have a growing number of countries colored here in green, which follow a differentiated regulatory approach. So what does it mean, a differentiated regulatory approach? So these technologies can be applied in many, many different ways. And depending on the outcome, the product can be indistinguishable from conventional breeding products, or it can be similar to a classical GMO. And those countries take the approach that they have a look at the product and then they decide it will be regulated as either as a conventional plant breeding product or as a GMO. And this kind of approach has been first developed by Southern American countries, specifically Argentina is taking the lead on that. But you can see it's a growing number of countries and recently even to African countries started to follow the same route. We have other countries which are still discussing their approaches. Those in light green are probably taking a similar approach like the dark green countries, while the ones colored here in yellow, like the EU, we don't know in which direction it will be going. So the Commission proposed or will present their proposal next year, hopefully early next year. And then we'll see in which direction we will be going. There are currently only 2 countries which have their, let's say, regulatory requirements fixed, and we also don't see specific discussions ongoing. So they are regulating as GMOs, and that's New Zealand and South Africa. But when it comes to trade and specifically commodity trade, of course, international harmonization of regulatory oversight is very, very important, specifically for products which are very similar to conventional products and where you can probably not make this distinction by simple detection methods that we use for GMO detection. So this creates, of course, on the one hand, it creates trade barriers. On the other hand, it also creates barriers in research and innovation when it comes to international research collaborations where scientists start to exchange germplasm and they need to also, of course, comply with the regulations in different countries. But it's also, of course, a matter for us as an industry, because 20% of the seed that is coming to the market is traded on an international level, and also movement of seed is, of course, no longer possible in a, let's say, easy way when we have these different regulations in place. Conclusions. I hope I could provide additional, let's say, arguments that plant breeding is really contributing to all different pillars of sustainability. NGTs, in the end, they are, let's say, an additional tool in the toolbox, and they can provide additional opportunities to support sustainability by reducing the breeding time and by specifically also helping to have more targeted approaches when it comes to very complex breeding schemes, complex genomes, crops with long generation times, etc. Enabling regulations support local developments and diversity of developers, and I haven't shown a slide on that one, but there are examples specifically from Argentina where you can see that compared to classical GMO approaches, you have many more local developers and more diversity of crops and traits that are developed if you have enabling regulations for those technologies. And those technologies are versatile. They can be applied in very different ways, and this is why we need differentiated regulatory approaches. So depending on the outcome of the application of those technologies, products should be regulated either as conventional breeding or as GMOs. And we hope that the EU will follow the growing number of countries taking this kind of differentiated approach. From our perspective, if we keep discussing within the current GMO framework, and we would go for just a, let's say, GMO light system, but the products will still be regulated as GMOs, we will be in the same situation as for classical GMOs. We will see no SMEs in Europe developing those products. We will have no cultivation and probably only imports, and that's probably not what we want to see if we consider those technologies really contributing to the goals of the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy. Thanks for your attention, and yeah, I'm happy to discuss further. I don't know if we have time now, but maybe later. Yeah.
Dámy a pánové, já děkuji Petře Jorasch za její prezentaci. I will give you your headphones. Maybe some questions will be in Czech. Also, Francesco Mattina and Irene de Tovar. Come here. Dámy a pánové, to bude taková jenom opravdu velmi krátká, improvizovaná diskuse, ale využijeme toho, že tady máme naše vzácné hosty. Pokud byste se tedy chtěli zeptat, tak ten prostor je právě teď. A prosím opravdu jenom velmi krátkou otázku a prosím zároveň i velmi stručnou odpověď. Potom v diskusi můžeme neformálně pokračovat u kávy, která nás čeká v následujících minutách. Tak je prostor pro dotaz, pokud má někdo otázku. A pan prezident také se chce přidat, promiňte.
Jestli dovolíte, abych se chtěl zeptat paní Petry, pro jakou variantu je. Jestli je pro rychlé přijetí potřebné legislativy pro nové šlechtitelské metody. Děkuji.
Thanks for the question. Yes, we of course in favor and we support the current Commission initiative to provide, let's say, a proposal which hopefully will, as I said, follow the approach taken by other countries. And of course, we would also like to see the proposal as early as possible on let's say, the table. We have European elections already in 2024, which means time is running, and after the Commission has has presented the proposal. It will still need discussion by Parliament and Council, of course, to be able to adopt the proposal in the end. And if this is possible before the European elections in 2024, very much depends on when the Commission will come up with its proposal, and as early as possible would be best in order to proceed and to have the next steps in its implementation.
Děkuji panu Hlaváčkovi za krátkou otázku, děkuji Petře Jorasch za stručnou odpověď. Další dotaz na některého z našich hostů.
Thank you very much. I have also a question to Petra Jorasch. Did I understand it correct that in US and in South America, NGT crops are already on the field, and in Europe we need 18 more years until we have the first NGT marketed? Is this another field where we lost? Thank you.
Potentially, yes. Yes, indeed, in South America, they have implemented their regulations already in Argentina starting in 2015. Products on the market, currently, at least what we know, it's one soybean product in the US and a tomato in Japan. So in view of actual products on the market, it's still limited, but we know from the databases, for example, in the US, where developers can consult with authorities on the regulation of potential products, that there's a lot in the pipeline. So we might see new products coming soon. But also what we heard from Mike, the current situation in Europe and Europe as also an importer of products from South and North America has an impact on the innovative capacity even in those countries which have enabling regulations, because nobody would dare to risk to bring a product to the EU which would be regulated here as a GMO, and where you might be liable for putting a product on the market that has no approval. So the regulatory situation in the EU has not only an impact on the innovative capacity within the EU, but also outside the EU. And as I said, I mean, when we come with a new regulatory approach, maybe in 27 or 28, depending on when Council, Parliament, and Commission can agree on a common text, that means we have a new regulation in place, but that doesn't mean we have products on the market. So because we cannot go to the field currently, we cannot test potential products which are in the pipeline in the field, which is needed before you can do variety development, and then it still needs 2, 3, 4 years until the product will be on the market. So meaning the farm-to-fork strategy will already be implemented when potential new product might come to the market, and if we have an enabling regulation by that time. Yeah, we are left behind.
Thank you. Next question.
Je to možná citlivá otázka, ale je na paní Jorasch a na pana Mattina. Znamená to, že NGT metody jsou v Evropě zatím zakázány, znamená to, že ani odrůdy by tady se neměly pohybovat. Do jaké míry jste si jistí, že tady už dávno nejsou?
Okay. Personal answer, no, I'm not sure. There is no way to know, and also if you look at our criteria and procedure to grant, for example, plant breeders' right, we don't know. We don't test it, we don't know. We don't ask the applicant, the breeder, to declare it in our, unless it is a GMO. And I would like also to say that depending on the evolution of the regulatory framework in the EU, I don't know if we will have to change eventually our regulation and ask applicants, for example, to declare when they apply for protection if they used one of these technique, which technique. But today is not the case.
I'm not so sure if I agree. I mean, you said you asked for a GMO, and currently those technologies are regulated as GMOs, so breeders would need to tick the box, it's a GMO. So I trust that all the companies comply with EU regulations. I'm sure there are no products on the market which are for cultivation in the EU. But of course, if we look at international trade and imports, we can maybe not sure if products will come to the EU at one point in time because we have the detection and identification issue. But for, let's say, regulatory compliance of companies producing seeds for the EU seed market, I'm pretty sure there's no product on the market.
Děkuji za odpověď Petře Jorasch. Protože pan prezident Doležal tady v této souvislosti pokyvoval, dovolím si tutéž otázku ponechat, dámy a pánové, a protože nás tíží čas, tak myslím, že už ukončíme tuto část debaty poslední odpovědí pana prezidenta. Možná, jestli stručně by se ještě pak Irene Tovar chtěla vyjádřit.
Já jenom velmi stručně, v podstatě jsem to tady zmínil v té prezentaci, tady jsou skutečně výzvy, které nás čekají téměř v horizontu několika měsíců, pokud se bavíme o nové společné zemědělské politice. Jsou tady výzvy, které nás čekají do roku 2030, pokud se bavíme o Evropské zelené dohodě a chybí nám tady skutečně nástroje, kterými bychom tyto výzvy mohli nějakým způsobem zvládnout. A jedním z těch nástrojů jsou určitě nové metody šlechtění. A pokud se tady pořád bavíme tady o tom, že to je otázka možná 3, 5, možná i více let, než budou moci vůbec producenti osiv tady v Evropě něco takového uvádět na trh, tak je to tristní. To je jedna věc. No a druhá věc je, pokud zároveň tady existuje jedna kolonka, která říká GMO/NGTs, tak my musíme pracovat minimálně na tom, aby ty kolonky byly do budoucna prostě 2, abychom tady měli to staré v úzovkách GMO a pak tady měli toho mendla, ať tedy budeme mendla brát jako Čecha nebo Němce, o tom jsou vždycky velké debaty, ale abychom tady prostě měli toho rychlejšího mendla v podobě těch nových genetických technik. A to je otázka, která si myslím, že by se měla vyřešit velmi rychle, protože my tady máme klimatickou změnu. Určitě vnímáte, jak nás často trápí sucho, jak nás trápí někdy zase choroby a další záležitosti a prostě tohle to je otázka, která se dá vyřešit poměrně rychle, ale je tam pořád prostě ta legislativní překážka.
Děkuji panu prezidentovi. Jenom velmi stručná reakce paní Irene Tovar.
I don't think there was a question for me to respond, but I will nod to every single
Maybe
word
I
that
can
the president...
ask you for sustainability and some safetiness for next generation in this context.
I think that we'll be going back to what a lot of us have been saying, that we need to have solutions that are science-based, and we need them so we can deliver in environmental terms. The gentleman over there asked, are we being left behind? I think the EU has been priding itself for, or at least claiming that it's a leader in sustainability, and maybe in this area they are not leading on this, so perhaps that will be my remark.
Thank you very much. Dámy a pánové, já vám všem děkuji za pozornost a děkuji našim milým hostům za účast v této krátké diskusi. Zároveň se omlouváme za drobné komplikace v programu, ale viděli jste, že všechny příspěvky byly nesmírně zajímavé a byla by škoda je krátit, stejně jako příspěvek Mikea Paustiana. Jehož cenné zkušenosti byly pro nás v mnohem objevné, tak vás teď v tuto chvíli zvu na kávu a myslím, že bychom se tady mohli setkat za necelých 10 minut nebo za 20 minut. Zkuste se rychle občerstvit, pokud se vám podaří, vezměte si kávu i sem do sálu, tak abychom mohli začít panelovou diskusi. Tak ještě jednou děkuju a čím dřív se tu setkáme, tím lépe. Díky za pozornost.